Hi students, let's continue government budget. Let's start with budget deficit. Budget deficit, that is government budget, refers to a situation when budget expenditure of the government are greater than the budget receipts. Budget deficit equals to total expenditure minus total receipts, which equal budget expenditure greater than budget receipts. Budgetary deficit is defined as the excess of total estimated expenditure over total estimated revenue. Yes, so when the government spends more than it collects, then it incurs a budgetary deficit. With reference to budget of Indian government, budgetary deficit can be three types. Types of budget deficit: revenue deficit, fiscal deficit, primary deficit. So budgetary deficit, expenditure is greater than revenue. Yes, we'll be calling it as a budgetary deficit. Deficit budget, estimated expenditure is greater than estimated revenue. Surplus budget, expenditure, that is estimated receipts, is greater than estimated expenditure. Revenue deficit. Revenue deficit is related to revenue expenditure and revenue receipts of the government. So revenue deficit is excess of revenue expenditure over revenue receipts. Revenue deficit is equal to revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. Yes. So revenue deficit is concerned with the revenue expenditure and revenue receipts of the government. So it refers to excess of revenue expenditure over revenue receipts during the given fiscal year. So revenue deficit equals to revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. So RD is equals to RE minus RR. Revenue deficit equals to revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. There are three ways of reducing revenue deficit. 1. Government cut its expenditure on subsidies. Government borrowing from general public, RBI, rest of the world. Disinvestment by way of selling its shares of public enterprises. Okay, let's see some implications of revenue deficit. It implies that government is dissaving, that is, government is using up saving of other sectors of the economy to finance its consumption expenditure. It indicates the inability of the government to meet its regular and recurring expenditure in the proposed budget. Use of capital receipts for meeting the extra consumption expenditure leads to an inflationary situation in the economy. Higher borrowing increases future burden in terms of loan amount and interest payment. So these are the implications of revenue deficit. Let's start with the other one. Fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is estimated accounting for all receipts other than borrowing and expenditure of the government. Fiscal deficit is the excess of total expenditure, that is revenue plus capital, over total receipts, that is revenue plus capital other than borrowing. So fiscal deficit is equals to total expenditure minus total receipts excluding borrowings. Let's see what are the implications of fiscal deficit. The first one, debt trap. What is meant by debt trap? Fiscal deficit indicates the total borrowing requirements of the government. Borrowing not only involved repayment of principal amount but also require payment of interest. So interest payment increases the revenue expenditure. This leads to the revenue deficit. It creates a vicious circles of fiscal deficit and revenue deficit, wherein government takes more loans to repay the earlier loans. As a result, country is caught in a debt trap. Now, inflation. This is the second implication. Government mainly borrows from Reserve Bank of India, RBI, to meet its fiscal deficit. RBI prints new currencies to meet the deficit requirements. It increases the money supply in the economy and creates inflationary pressure. Third one, foreign dependence. government also borrow from rest of the world, which rises its dependence on other country. Yes, so far we have discussed about the implications of fiscal deficit. The last one, primary deficit. Primary deficit is the differences between fiscal deficit and interest payment. So, primary deficit equal to fiscal deficit minus interest payment. PD is equals to FD minus IP, interest payment. Implication of primary deficit is, it indicates how much the government borrowing are going to meet expenses other than the interest payments. The difference between fiscal deficit and primary deficit, which shows the amount interest payment on the borrowing made in past. Yes, so a low or a zero primary deficit indicates that interest commitments on earlier loans have forced the government to borrow. So this is the implication of primary deficit. So far we have discussed about budgetary deficit, types of budgetary deficit, revenue deficit, fiscal deficit and primary deficit. Thank you, students.